with the Broadcasting Complaints Commission of South Africa, the BCCSA. Now, this follows an interview with the mother of convicted child rapist Nicholas Ninow. The SABC is dealing with the matter and will respond to complaints lodged against it via the Commission. A little bit earlier on, we spoke to Not In My Name's Mo Senne.
There is in no way that this is in the best interest of the child. What this interview is saying is that it's possible for rape to become a mistake. It's possible for you to excuse it with drugs, to call on the insanity plea, to use all sorts of measures to try to evade the fact that he is problematic on his own. Yes, the mother may have contributed in however way, but this is not the platform. If she felt that there was something that she was sorry for, that she's being tormented and coming into an epiphany, that's fine. She should do that in her own private and personal capacity. Must not use South African resources to perpetuate these kind of ideas. And it also reflects very vividly onto white privilege. How many people have you had their mothers being interviewed, having them have the platform to come and cry here and tell us that they're sorry and it was a mistake? He doesn't know. When has rape ever been a mistake? It's a series of decisions that you're taking from the point of departure. Nicholas Ninow, honestly, I'm not even afraid to say that this is something that was recurrent, that has been ongoing in his mind. He thought about it. You can't just in such a public domain feel that you're safe enough to do what you have done and then come and call it a mistake. You've had so many chances. You've had to go to rehab. You even succeeded somehow to get our system to get to take you for psychological evaluation, and yet they found nothing. And over again, he's been given a platform where it steals the family's ability and chance to heal. It is unacceptable. It is not necessary. And we actually demand that it's taken down and no longer viewed. We don't see the necessity for this.
All right, so for a little bit more on this, we're now joined on the line by Taryn Hinton, who's Media Monitoring Africa's legal advisor. Thanks very much indeed for joining us on the line, Taryn. When we look at this story, it's garnered this reaction that perhaps some people might have been surprised by and others shocked that we did the story. When you look at it through the lens of perhaps ethics and ethical obligations of journalists, what thoughts come to mind for you?
Great, thank you for having me on the show. Really, when I look at it, what you have to assess is whether there's a public interest in the story, and there clearly was a public interest in the greater story, and that was evidenced by the broadcasting, the engagement across multiple platforms on the trial and sentencing, as well as the evidence in mitigation and aggravation. So I do believe that there is a clear public interest in the telling of the greater story. I suppose the concern that comes in is what is the motives of telling this story? And if the motives of the story is to engage on what the motivations are for rape and why men engage on rape being a crime of power, was there an opportunity for a right of reply and in order to engage on those issues granted to the other side, or what were the concerns that were taken into consideration when doing that interview?
So what would a right of reply have been? If you interview the mother, then you run the risk of identifying the child in the process. Of
course. We absolutely do not want to flout the Criminal Procedure Act, Section 1543, or the BCCSA code, or the SABC code in that regard. But there are many experts in the field, and at this stage it's not certain whether those experts were given an opportunity to engage on the deeper issues of rape. It's clear when we look at across platforms on rape, we see predominantly when the victim is white, they do get a greater platform, and there's a greater opportunity for voices to be heard. If we look at the young woman who was raped and murdered in Newlands, the victim family did get a lot of opportunity to engage. We never heard from rapists' family or parents, and there was no deeper engagement on why rape. And I think really what we have to unpack is what were the motivations of doing the story and what was trying to be achieved in the story itself.
Well, I mean, during the court case itself, Nicholas Ninow said, my mother led me to drugs. She got me into this mess, essentially. And I just wonder then, isn't there a case to say, well, let's hear from the mother who was accused directly by the person convicted?
Yes, I mean, obviously, and again, I go back to my statements around there being a public interest in this because it was a part of his testimony and his evidence that was put forward, and that was the basis of her engagement. But there's no right of reply on that from her side, and in actual fact, what it did was if the position of the SABC was to further engage on the issues. I'm not certain what would have come out of a longer interview if that was aired, but it would be really necessary to engage on the deeper issues around rape and to understand if she's been given a platform to engage on this. There can be no justification for her making statements to the extent that this was a terrible mistake. He was found guilty of rape in a court of law and sentenced to life imprisonment. But the issue is what's at the heart of the interview, and if it's at the heart of the interview that there's a public interest in the public knowing the reasons and motivations for why men rape, that would be in the public interest. But it would then depend on how that played out during the duration of the interview and what rights of reply there was from other experts. So whilst we couldn't engage the mother, we couldn't access anyone directly or indirectly to be able to expose the identity of the young victim, there are a number of experts who could engage on issues of rape and why men rape, which would be both beneficial and educational and informative to the public at large.
At the center of all of this, of course, is a child who I believe is now 8 years old and is probably old enough to understand what's happening around her. So when you consider doing a story like this, do you have to think about the child and say that, you know, whilst it's in the public interest, maybe she might be a victim again for us playing this particular story?
That's an excellent question because, you know, when we are engaging with on issues around children, Section 28.2 says that the rights of the child are of paramount importance in all matters involving the child. And when we're looking at a public interest defense, it's an objective test. But when we're looking at the best interest of the child, it's subjective. So we would need to look at the interests of that child in particular. And therefore, there needs extreme sensitivity on how this is reported. Is there any a way of engaging or knowing who that child is? And I mean, to date, the media has treated that, in my opinion, and from what we've seen, well, and has not disclosed in any way direct or indirect identification of that child. And that's really what we want to uphold. We want to try and ensure that no secondary trauma is perpetrated on that child.
All right, so there's been this public outrage. So the question now becomes, given what's been said and the complaints that have been lodged, does the public broadcaster then pull the story?
You see, it's a challenging one because it's not from the basis of that short clip. I would say it's not clear that there's any purpose served in the story. Insofar as is it just feeding into this whole stereotype that has got good basis that we're dealing with white victims that they get more coverage than for example black victims. And if that's the case, yes. And if the purpose of the story is merely to give a mother a platform to try and plead some level of empathy or sympathy for a rapist, yes. If the purpose of the story is greater than that, to unpack and understand why rapists rape, that's a very different position. But I cannot tell you from the basis of that short clip.
All right. And then just generally, on the basis just on public outrage, is that sufficient? So if any story comes up and the public just say, we don't like that story, is that sufficient reason to pull a story?
You know, I mean, that would definitely be an editorial decision. The challenge that rests is that obviously if it's referred to the BCCSA, they've got to then judge it according to the code and whether it flouts or breaches the code itself. So that's a different argument. But the SABC there is there to serve the Republic of South Africa and the people of South Africa. And if the people have spoken, I would say that is a basis. Or it's a basis on which to revisit the story from a position where it will achieve the purpose for which it may have been intended. In other words, there's a public interest in the question of why rapists rape, and therefore we're delving into that because those are not stories that are told very often.
All right. Okay, Taryn, thanks so much indeed for your insights. That's Taryn Hinton, who's legal advisor for media monitoring and Africa.